Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. For about a year, I lived in a shared house with 4 other housemates. It was one of those places where everyone is doing their own thing, schedules never fully match, and the house always feels slightly lived in, but never truly organized. It wasn't a bad place, just one of those typical shared rentals where privacy is limited, and the environment slowly becomes a mix of different habits, personalities, and routines overlapping each other. The house itself was fairly large compared to what we actually used. One of its main features was a big backyard that came with a garage and a small tool shed at the far end. On paper, it sounded like a useful space, but in reality, we almost never used any of it. The garage stayed closed most of the time, and the shed was the kind of place people only mentioned when they were talking about storage, but never actually went into. It just existed in the background of the property, like something that belonged there but wasn't really part of our daily life. There were also motion detector lights installed in the backyard. At night, they would turn on automatically whenever something moved outside. Most of the time, it was probably small animals or wind shifting things around. At least that's what I assumed. It was never something I paid much attention to in the beginning. Outdoor lights doing random things felt normal enough, especially in a place with trees and open space around it. But not everyone in the house saw it the same way. 2 of my housemates were very superstitious. They strongly believed in ghosts, spirits, and other supernatural things. It was something they talked about quite often, especially when they were bored or when the night got quiet. They would interpret small, ordinary events as signs of something unusual. If a door creaked, if a light flickered, or if something moved outside at the wrong time, they would connect it to something paranormal almost immediately. They also sometimes used different substances, which in their case made those beliefs feel even more intense. On some nights, their fear or imagination would grow stronger, and they would start seeing meaning in things that others wouldn't even notice. To them, the house already had a strange energy. To me, it was just an old shared rental with a slightly messy backyard and a few faulty lights. The backyard lights became one of those ongoing mystery topics in the house. They would randomly turn on at night, sometimes for no clear reason. My housemates were convinced that something supernatural was triggering them. They would talk about it seriously, saying things like it must be a presence or some kind of spirit moving around outside. I always thought there was a much simpler explanation. Animals, wind, maybe just a sensitive motion sensor. That seemed far more realistic to me. But living with people who already believed in something else meant that even simple things started to feel like part of a bigger story for them. Then things became a bit more intense. One of my housemates told us she had seen something outside the house late at night. She said she had looked out through the window and saw what she described as a man-like figure near the backyard area. According to her, and it looked like someone was peering in or standing near the window, but she was also high at the time, so her experience was mixed with fear and confusion. The way she described it made the situation feel more dramatic for her, but for me it still didn't immediately change how I viewed things. I assumed it was likely a combination of imagination, shadows, and the influence of whatever she had taken. Old houses and dark backyards can easily distort perception at night. Shapes can look like figures when there is not enough light, and the mind often fills in gaps when it is already expecting something unusual. Still, after she said that, the ghost idea became even more active in the house. My other housemates started talking about it more seriously, and there was this growing shared belief that something unexplained was happening in the backyard. Even if I didn't fully agree, I couldn't deny that the atmosphere in the house started to feel different. Not necessarily dangerous, but slightly more tense in a strange way. A few nights after that, I had my own experience that made me pause for a moment. It was late, and I was outside near the house. I had been drinking that night, so my judgment wasn't completely sharp, and my awareness was a bit foggy. At some point, I thought I saw a man through the mesh door that led to the backyard. It was just a quick glance, not something I could clearly confirm. It looked like a human shape standing or moving near the outside area. In that moment, I didn't immediately panic. My first thought wasn't fear, it was doubt. I assumed my mind was playing tricks on me because of everything I had already heard from my housemates. When people around you keep repeating the idea that something supernatural is happening, your brain naturally becomes more sensitive to anything that even slightly matches that expectation. So I brushed it off. I told myself it was probably nothing. A shadow, a reflection, or just my imagination influenced by alcohol and all the ghost talk I had been hearing for days. I didn't think much more about it after that. Life in the house continued normally after that. The backyard lights still turned on occasionally. My housemates still talked about spirits sometimes, and I still didn't take it too seriously. In my mind, it was just a mix of coincidence, faulty sensors, and overactive imagination. Eventually, I moved out of the house and went back to my home country. Life changed, routines changed, and that chapter slowly became something in the past. The house itself became one of those memories you don't really think about often unless something reminds you of it. Then, about 6 months after I'd left, I had a FaceTime call with one of my old housemates. We were just catching up, talking about normal things at first, nothing serious. Then the conversation shifted back to the house, as it often does when people who once lived together start remembering shared experiences. We talked about the backyard, the lights, and even the strange feeling we sometimes had about things happening at night. That's when she told me something that completely changed how I understood everything from that time. She said that it hadn't been a ghost at all. There was a homeless man who had been living in our toolshed. According to her, he had been there for a while. No one knows exactly how long, but it was long enough that he had been using the space without us realizing it. The shed we never used, the one we barely thought about, had apparently been occupied in secret while we were all living just a short distance away in the main house. Hearing that made everything from that year suddenly look different in my mind. The motion lights in the backyard, the strange movement at night, even the feeling of seeing a figure through the mesh door started to take on a completely new meaning. What had been dismissed as imagination or superstition now had a very real explanation behind it. It wasn't something supernatural at all. It was something much more grounded, but also much more unsettling in a different way. What stayed with me most was not just the fact that someone had been there, but how easily it had gone unnoticed. We lived in the house every day. We walked past that backyard constantly. We knew the shed existed, but we never really checked it or thought about it properly. It was just part of the background. And that's what made the whole thing feel so strange afterward. Not fear in a dramatic sense, but a quiet realization that a space you assume is empty isn't always as empty as you think. Looking back, the superstition in the house almost made it harder to see what was actually happening. Because once people decide something is a ghost, they stop looking for more ordinary explanations. And when something ordinary is happening in the background, it becomes easier to miss. In the end, it wasn't anything supernatural or mysterious. It was just a real person living in a space we all ignored. But even now, thinking about it gives me that same strange feeling. Not because it was terrifying, but because it showed how easily something real can exist right next to you without you ever fully noticing it. When I look back on it now, it feels like one of those situations that didn't fully register at the time, not because it wasn't strange, but because life has a way of making you move on from things before you understand their full weight. At the time, I wasn't really thinking deeply about consequences or patterns or anything like that. I was younger, more impulsive, and honestly a bit careless with how I made decisions. A work friend had introduced me to a guy she knew, and we ended up meeting briefly. It wasn't anything complicated or serious in the beginning. It just felt like a normal introduction that turned into spending time together. We got along easily. There was nothing unusual about it in those early moments. Conversations flowed naturally, and there was a kind of comfort in how simple everything felt between us. It didn't feel forced or awkward. It was just two people enjoying each other's company without overthinking it. Eventually, things moved quickly, as they sometimes do when there is a sense of connection and everything feels relaxed. We ended up sleeping together, and I remember thinking afterward that it had been one of those rare experiences where everything just worked without effort. At the time, I didn't read too much into it beyond that. It was just a moment in my life, nothing more significant than that. A couple of days passed, and I didn't hear from him. That wasn't unusual either. People drift in and out, especially after short encounters like that, so I didn't think much of it. Then, completely unexpectedly, something happened that didn't make sense. He called my workplace and left a message with the receptionist. Oh, the message was not just distant or cold. It was harsh in a way that felt completely disconnected from how our interaction had been. He said he wanted nothing to do with me, that I should leave him alone, and that I should never contact him again. When I was told about it, I remember feeling confused more than anything else. It didn't match reality as I understood it. There had been no argument, no disagreement, no attempt from my side to reach out to him at all. I hadn't called him, I hadn't messaged him, I hadn't done anything that would explain such a strong reaction. It felt like I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had nothing to do with me. At first, I considered just letting it go. People sometimes behave strangely for reasons you never get to understand, and I assumed this might just be one of those cases. Maybe he misread something. Maybe there was another situation I wasn't aware of, or maybe it was just his way of closing things off in an overly dramatic manner. Whatever the reason, I decided not to engage with it. I told myself it wasn't worth my energy, and I moved on. On the surface, life went back to normal. Work continued, routines continued, and the memory of him faded into the background like most brief encounters do. But a couple of weeks later, something happened that shifted the entire context of that experience in a way I could never have anticipated. There was news that a young woman had been found dead in a nearby town. It was the kind of story that spreads quickly, not because people want details, but because the shock of it makes it impossible to ignore. It was reported that she had been killed in a violent manner, and the discovery itself was deeply disturbing for the community. At first, I only heard fragments of it through conversations and general news updates. I didn't connect it to anything in my own life. It was just another tragic headline in a world that, unfortunately, has too many of them. Then came the arrest. The man I had briefly dated was taken into custody in connection with the case. I remember the moment I heard that very clearly. It didn't feel real at first. It was one of those statements your mind rejects before it fully processes it. There is a gap between hearing something and accepting it, and in that gap, everything feels suspended. Eventually, the details became clearer through official reports and confirmations. He'd been arrested, and later he pleaded guilty to the crime. And the reason that was given was something that stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. It was said that the motive was rejection, that simple, devastating idea that she had refused him, and that refusal had escalated into something irreversible. Hearing that changed the way I understood everything that had happened in the weeks before. My brief experience with him, the sudden and hostile message left at my workplace, the confusion I had felt at the time, all of it suddenly took on a different meaning. Not because I had been part of the same situation, but because I realized I had seen a small, disconnected fragment of something much larger and much darker without knowing it. What had felt like a random emotional reaction from him before now felt like a warning sign I hadn't been able to interpret at the time. Not something directed at me in a literal sense, but a glimpse into a mindset that I had not been aware of. It was unsettling in a very specific way, not just because of what had happened, but because of how ordinary everything had seemed before that point. There was nothing about our interaction that suggested where things would eventually lead. That contrast between normalcy and reality is what made it difficult to process. When you think about it afterward, it raises uncomfortable questions about how little we truly know about people in brief encounters. Someone can appear completely normal in one setting, even pleasant, even kind, and yet be carrying something entirely different beneath the surface. It is not something you can always see in conversation or behavior in a short amount of time. At the same time, it also creates a strange feeling of distance from your own memory. I found myself replaying those moments, trying to see if there had been anything I missed, anything that should have stood out. But there wasn't anything obvious. That is part of what makes it so difficult to fully process. There is no clear warning sign you can point to and say you should have known. The message he left at my workplace suddenly felt different in hindsight, too. At the time, I had interpreted it as something confusing but harmless, maybe even just an emotional overreaction. But after learning what came later, it became harder to separate that moment from the broader reality of who he was and what he was capable of. Still, I want to be clear that there is no sense of personal connection between me and what happened beyond that brief and unrelated overlap in time. It was not something I was involved in, and I was not part of the events that led to the crime. But even being indirectly connected through timing alone was enough to leave an impression that never really goes away completely. What stayed with me most wasn't shock in the immediate sense, but something quieter. A lingering awareness that life can intersect with people in ways that seem ordinary at first, and only later reveal a completely different reality in the background. It also made me think about how quickly we categorize experiences as finished. A short relationship, a strange message, a confusing reaction, All of those things are usually filed away mentally as things to move on from. Most of the time, that is exactly what they are meant to be. But sometimes, you only learn much later that the story connected to them didn't actually end where you thought it did. Over time, the intensity of the memory fades, but it doesn't disappear completely. It becomes more like something you reference internally when you think about judgment, awareness, and how limited our understanding of people can be in brief interactions. Not in a way that creates constant fear, but in a way that adds a layer of caution to how you interpret situations in general. A reminder that what you see in a short moment is not always the full picture of a person's life or behavior. And maybe that is the part that stays the longest. Not the event itself, but the realization that normal, even pleasant moments can sit very close to things you would never expect, without any visible boundary between them at the time. It is not something you think about every day, but once you have experienced a connection like that, even indirectly, it never really feels like just another story anymore. This kind of situation really shows how quickly something that feels completely normal can shift into uncertainty, depending on timing, perception, and the small decisions someone makes under pressure without having the full picture of what is actually going on. For her, it started like any other ordinary drive home. Nothing about that day felt unusual or out of place. She was simply on the road she had used many times before, in a familiar rhythm where driving doesn't require much active thinking anymore. Her mind was relaxed, partly focused on the road and partly somewhere else, like most people experience when they are doing something routine. There was no reason for alertness, no expectation that anything different from usual traffic would happen. The roads were normal, the flow of vehicles was normal, and everything around her felt predictable. In situations like this, people don't actively search for danger. They rely on habit. They trust that everything will continue the way it always has. That sense of familiarity is exactly what makes these moments feel safe, even when you are surrounded by constant movement and strangers and vehicles around you. So when another car appeared behind her, it didn't immediately stand out. Cars come and go all the time on the road. Some pass quickly, some stay behind for a while, and most of them never carry any meaning beyond simple traffic. At first, the situation would have felt exactly the same, just another vehicle sharing the road. But as the car came closer, the presence of flashing lights changed the entire feeling of the moment. That change doesn't happen slowly. It happens almost instantly in the mind. The brain shifts from relaxed mode into alert mode in a fraction of a second. A signal like flashing lights is deeply associated with authority and instruction. Most people are trained almost automatically to respond by pulling over without thinking too deeply about it. It is a learned behavior built from years of understanding that emergency or official vehicles have priority and must be respected. But in this case, something didn't fully match that expectation. The vehicle didn't look clearly official. It didn't carry the usual signs people associate with law enforcement. That mismatch created a very uncomfortable kind of confusion. On one hand, there were flashing lights and a clear signal to pull over. On the other hand, there was something about the appearance that didn't feel right or familiar. These two signals were conflicting, and the brain does not like conflicting information, especially when everything is happening quickly. This is where pressure begins to build, even if nothing has physically changed yet. The danger is not always obvious. Sometimes it comes from not knowing which signal to trust. In that moment, she didn't immediately react the way most people might instinctively react. Instead of fully committing to pulling over, she slowed down mentally as much as she could. There was a feeling that something about the situation didn't align properly, even if she couldn't clearly explain why. That kind of hesitation is small, almost invisible, but it can become extremely important in situations where clarity is missing. Rather than stopping right away, she created a pause. She didn't rush into a decision based only on visual signals. Instead, she reached out to her boyfriend. That decision might seem simple from the outside, but in a high-pressure moment like this, it breaks the automatic flow of compliance. It interrupts the momentum that would normally push someone to just stop and follow instructions without questioning them. That pause gave her something extremely valuable: time. Time to think, time to question, time to verify. While still on the road, she explained what was happening and asked for help in understanding whether the situation made sense. That conversation was not just about reassurance. It was a way of grounding herself in another perspective, instead of being trapped inside the pressure of the moment alone. When you are alone in a situation like that, every signal feels stronger. But when you bring in another voice, even briefly, it reduces that isolation and creates space for better judgment. Her boyfriend advised her not to react too quickly and instead reach out to local authorities for confirmation. That step changed everything about the direction of the situation. Instead of acting purely on what she could see behind her in the mirror, she now had a way to check whether what she was experiencing was actually legitimate. She contacted the local police and explained the situation clearly. That call became the turning point where confusion started to shift into structure. Instead of uncertainty and instinct, there was now communication with an official source that could actually verify what was happening on the road. The response from authorities was calm but very clear. She was instructed to continue driving and not to stop for the unmarked vehicle. That instruction immediately changed the meaning of the situation. It confirmed that what she was seeing behind her did not align with a standard, safe traffic stop scenario. At that point, the emotional weight of the situation would have changed again. Before that instruction, there was uncertainty. After it, there was direction. Even if she didn't fully understand what was happening yet, she now knew she was not supposed to stop. That clarity alone reduces a huge amount of internal pressure because it removes the need to guess. As she continued driving, everything behind the scenes began to escalate. What she couldn't fully see at that moment was that law enforcement was now treating the situation seriously. Additional units were being coordinated, and the situation was no longer just about a single vehicle on the road. It had become something that required controlled response and verification. The presence of an unmarked vehicle behaving like a police car raised serious concerns. That is not something taken lightly, because impersonation of authority on the road carries real risk for public safety. So while she kept driving under instruction, a separate response was forming around the situation she had encountered. Soon after, marked police units arrived in the area. Their arrival changed the entire dynamic on the road. What had been a confusing and tense situation for her became something structured and controlled from an external perspective. Police units began positioning themselves in relation to the unmarked vehicle, carefully managing the situation to avoid escalation or confusion for anyone nearby. From her perspective inside her own car, this would have been the moment when confusion finally started to clear. What she had been unsure about just moments earlier was now visibly being handled by official responders. The presence of clearly marked police vehicles created a sharp contrast with the unmarked car that had been following her. She was then directed to move to a safe distance. That instruction separated her completely from the active situation and removed her from any immediate risk. At that point, she was no longer part of the unfolding event on the road. She had become an observer rather than a participant, which is exactly how these situations are meant to be handled once authorities take control. With everything now contained, the truth of the situation became clear. The man driving the unmarked vehicle was impersonating a police officer. That realization changes the entire emotional weight of the experience. What initially felt like a confusing traffic stop attempt was actually something far more intentional and deceptive. It was built on exploiting the natural trust people place in flashing lights and authority signals on the road. This is what makes situations like this particularly unsettling. Most people are trained from a young age to respond quickly to authority on the road. Flashing lights mean stop. Instructions from officers mean comply. That system exists for safety, and in most cases it works exactly as intended. But when someone imitates that system, it creates a dangerous overlap between trust and manipulation. Looking back, what stands out most is how narrowly this situation avoided becoming something much worse. The outcome was not determined by one big action, but by several small decisions made in a very short period of time. First, there was the moment of hesitation, where she didn't fully commit to stopping immediately. Then there was the decision to involve someone else, instead of handling it alone. After that came the step of contacting authorities for confirmation, rather than relying only on what she could see. Each of these actions built on the previous one, slowly creating distance from automatic reaction. It's interesting how often safety in real life comes down to something that simple. Not specialized knowledge, not training, but the willingness to pause for just a moment when something doesn't fully make sense. That pause is small, but it can completely change the direction of a situation. After everything was over, the emotional impact doesn't disappear immediately. Even when a situation is resolved safely, the mind tends to replay it in fragments. What if she had stopped immediately? What if she had been alone? What if she hadn't questioned it at all? These thoughts are natural after high-pressure experiences like this, even when the outcome is positive. Over time, though, the experience becomes something more reflective than frightening. It turns into a reminder of how quickly normal life can shift into uncertainty, and how important it is to trust not just external signals, but also those small internal doubts when something feels slightly off. In the end, what protected her wasn't panic or confrontation. It was not rushing into a decision when everything around her was pushing her to act immediately. It was a brief moment of hesitation that created space for verification, and that space made all the difference between uncertainty and safety. Me and about 5 or 6 friends were driving in 2 cars together on Interstate 84, heading west through Oregon, somewhere around 8 miles east of the Dalles. We were on our way to a concert in Portland, an AC/DC show we had all been looking forward to for a long time. The whole trip had that usual mix of excitement and casual chaos that happens when a group of friends travel together, especially when music is involved and everyone is in a good mood. Most of that stretch of highway runs alongside the Columbia River, which forms the natural border between Oregon and Washington. It's a beautiful drive during the day, but at night it feels completely different. The same scenery that looks peaceful and opens in daylight becomes darker, quieter, and a little more isolated once the sun goes down. The river disappears into black reflections, and the road starts to feel like it is cutting through empty space. At one point, the highway changes into a section that feels more enclosed. It narrows into a two-lane westbound stretch that seems to extend out into the river itself. In that area, the road is almost surrounded by water on both sides. On one side, there is the main flow of the Columbia River, and on the other side, there is a kind of separated water section that looks almost like a small lake, trapped between parts of the highway. Guardrails run along both sides of the pavement, and beyond them is just dark water reflecting whatever little light exists from the cars. It's the kind of place where your awareness naturally sharpens a little, even if you are not consciously thinking about it. The road feels more confined, and there are fewer visual distractions. At night, especially when you are driving at highway speed, everything becomes a tunnel of headlights and faint reflections. I was driving in the left lane, maintaining around 65 miles per hour. The cars in our group were spaced behind us, probably about 8 car lengths apart. We had been cruising like that for a while, staying together but not too close, just enjoying the drive and talking between cars when we could. It was dark enough at that point that details outside the headlights were hard to make out. Everything beyond the reach of the beams felt like empty space. The rhythm of the drive was steady, nothing unusual, just a highway movement and the low hum of tires on asphalt. Everyone was focused on getting to Portland, thinking about the concert and the night ahead. Then, in a moment that completely broke that rhythm, something appeared directly in my lane. At first, my brain didn't even process it properly. It was sudden and too close. There was no gradual recognition, no time for the mind to slowly identify what was happening. One moment, the road was clear, and the next, there was a figure standing in the middle of the left lane, directly in front of the car. It looked like a person, but everything about it felt wrong in a way that is hard to explain. The shape was human, but the appearance was disturbing enough that it didn't register as normal. It was standing right in the path of the car, facing toward us, and it raised its arms as if acknowledging or reacting to the approaching headlights. What stood out most was the face. In the brief second that I saw it, it looked bright red, almost like it was covered in blood or painted in a way that made it look unnatural under the headlights. The combination of the long trench coat, the stance in the middle of a highway at night, and that red face created an image that felt more like something out of a horror film than anything you would ever expect to encounter in real life. There was no time to think through what it was or why it was there. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. It was pure instinct from that point on. I immediately swerved just enough to avoid hitting it. The movement was sharp but controlled, a quick correction rather than a full panic turn. Because at that speed and on that road, overreacting could have caused a crash just as easily as the obstacle itself. The car shifted slightly to the side, and we passed by it with barely enough clearance. In that instant, everything in the car changed. The noise, the laughter, the casual energy from earlier in the drive all disappeared. There is a very specific kind of silence that follows a moment like that, where everyone is trying to understand what they just saw, but no one can fully put it into words immediately. But almost instantly after that, my thoughts shifted to the second car behind us. Our friends were still back there, following the same lane, coming up on the exact same stretch of road. I had no idea if they had seen it yet, or if it was still ahead of them at the same position it had been when we passed. That uncertainty created a completely different kind of tension, because it was no longer just about what I had seen, but about what they were about to encounter. We tried to signal and react as quickly as we could, but everything was happening too fast. In moments like that, communication between cars is limited to instinct and timing. You cannot fully warn someone about something that shocking in real time when you are already moving at highway speed. A few seconds later, I saw their headlights approaching the same section of road. From my position ahead, I could only watch as they entered the area where it had been standing. I didn't know exactly how it would play out for them, only that they were now in the same danger we had just narrowly avoided. They swerved hard. It was a sharp, sudden movement, clearly an emergency reaction. The kind of maneuver that tells you the driver saw something unexpected at the last possible moment. The car shifted violently within the lane, and for a brief moment it looked like they might lose control completely. On a road like that, with guardrails on both sides and water nearby, there is almost no margin for error. But somehow they managed to keep the car on the road. They avoided hitting whatever was there, just like we had, and regained control after that split second of instability. It was one of those moments where everything feels like it could have gone very wrong very quickly, but somehow doesn't. After that, there was no more conversation between the cars. No joking on the radio. No excitement about the concert. Nothing like that. The mood changed completely. Everyone was just focused on continuing forward and getting out of that stretch of highway as quickly as possible. We kept driving until we reached the Dalles, which was the next significant stop along the route. Once we got there, we pulled over to collect ourselves and talk about what had just happened. There was a shared understanding that something extremely unusual had occurred, even if none of us could fully explain it in a satisfying way. We discussed it in detail, trying to make sense of it. What it looked like, where it was standing, how it moved, how close it had been. Everyone's version of what they saw matched in the important parts, especially the positioning in the lane and the sudden need to swerve. That consistency made it feel more real, not less, even though it was difficult to accept. We decided to report it, just in case there was some explanation or concern that needed to be addressed. It was the kind of thing you don't just ignore, especially on a highway where something like that could easily cause a serious accident. But after that report, nothing ever came back. There was no follow-up, no confirmation, no explanation of what it could have been or whether anything was found in that area. It was as if the entire incident existed only in that moment and nowhere else afterward. Over time, that lack of explanations what made it stick in memory even more. If there had been a clear answer, even a simple one, it might have faded like any other strange road experience. But instead, it remained unresolved. Looking back, what stands out most is how quickly everything shifted. One moment, we were just a group of friends driving to a concert, thinking about music and the night ahead. The next moment, we were dealing with something completely unexpected on a dark stretch of highway, reacting on instinct with no time to understand what was happening. It also leaves you thinking about how perception works in low visibility situations, especially at night on high-speed roads. Headlights can distort distance and shape, and when something appears suddenly in your path, your brain fills in gaps in ways that you don't fully control. In moments like that, you are not analyzing carefully. You are reacting. But even with all that in mind, the experience still feels difficult to categorize neatly. It was real enough in the sense that multiple people saw it, reacted to it, and nearly had accidents because of it. At the same time, it remains unclear enough that it never fully resolves into a simple explanation. In the end, what stays with me most is not just the image itself, but the feeling of that moment. The sudden interruption of normal driving, the instant shift into emergency reaction, and the silence that followed afterward as we all tried to process what had just happened. Some experiences don't stay with you because they make perfect sense. They stay with you because they don't. What happened to you is the kind of experience no child should ever have to go through, and it makes complete sense that it stayed with you for so long. When something like that happens at a young age, it doesn't get processed the same way it would in adulthood. A child doesn't have the mental framework to fully understand danger, intention, or manipulation, especially when the person in front of them is older and framing everything as if it is harmless or playful. In situations like that, children naturally rely on trust. They assume the environment they are in is safe, and they also tend to mirror the tone of the situation they are placed in. If someone is acting like everything is normal or joking around, a child often adapts to that tone even if something inside them feels uncertain. That internal confusion is very real, but it doesn't always translate into clear understanding at the moment. Looking back at what you described, one of the most important things to recognize is that none of that was normal behavior. It was not appropriate in any way for someone older to involve a child in situations that created fear or pressure, especially when it involved anything that could be perceived as threatening or unsafe. A child should never be placed in a position where they are forced to interpret fear, while also being expected to treat it as something normal or harmless. At the time, though, your reaction makes complete sense. When children are exposed to overwhelming or confusing situations, they don't respond with fully formed judgment. They respond based on instinct, environment, and the emotional signals around them. If something is presented as a joke or a game, a child might laugh or participate, not because they understand or agree, but because they are trying to stay in sync with the situation and avoid standing out or creating conflict. That is why your response in the moment cannot be seen as understanding or agreement. It was a child trying to navigate something far beyond their emotional capacity, trying to interpret signals that didn't make sense. In those moments, the brain often switches into a kind of survival mode without the person even realizing it. Things are happening too fast for clear reasoning, and the focus becomes simply getting through it. What also stands out is the emotional shift that happened later. When a situation crosses a certain internal threshold, the body and mind often react more strongly than they did at the time it was happening. Fear can build quietly, and sometimes it doesn't fully surface until the situation escalates or until afterward when the mind finally has space to process it. That is why experiences like crying, panic, or desperate attempts to escape can happen, even if earlier there was confusion or even forced laughter. The decision to escape in that moment shows how strongly your survival instinct was activated. In overwhelming situations, especially for children, the mind does not always look for the safest or most logical solution. It looks for the fastest way to remove itself from danger or discomfort. That is not something you consciously plan in detail, and it is a reaction that comes from a deeper place in the nervous system, when it detects that staying put is no longer tolerable. Afterward, the silence you described also makes a lot of sense. Many children don't immediately tell someone about confusing or frightening experiences. This is especially true when the situation was mixed with elements that felt unclear, or when the person involved presented it as if nothing serious had happened. There is often a strange emotional gap afterward, where the child is left carrying the memory but not yet sure how to translate it into words that an adult will understand. In that space, silence can feel like the easiest option, not because the experience was forgotten, but because it is difficult to explain something that doesn't fit neatly into language. Children often worry about being misunderstood, or they assume that what they experienced might not be taken seriously. So they hold it inside, sometimes for days, sometimes longer, until something finally pushes them to speak. When you eventually told your mother, the strong reaction she had is actually an important part of the story. It shows that from an adult perspective, the situation was immediately recognized as serious and not acceptable. Adults are able to see boundaries and risks more clearly, especially when looking at behavior that a child might struggle to interpret in the moment. That difference in perspective often becomes a turning point, because it confirms that what felt confusing or unsettling was not just imagined. Even if explanations were given afterward, those explanations don't erase the impact of what happened. Sometimes people try to make sense of situations like this by offering reasoning or context, but the emotional imprint is already formed. What stays with a person is not just what happened externally, but how it felt internally while it was happening. That combination of fear, confusion, and lack of control is what tends to remain in memory long after the actual event. From a psychological point of view, experiences like this often get stored in a very specific way. Instead of being remembered like a normal story with a beginning, middle, and end, they are remembered in fragments. Certain images, emotions, or physical sensations become sharper than the rest. That is why even years later, people can recall small details very clearly, while other parts feel blurry or incomplete. The brain tends to preserve what felt emotionally intense, especially when there was no sense of safety or resolution at the time. It is also very common for people to look back on these kinds of experiences and feel a sense of disbelief, almost like trying to connect two versions of reality. The present version, where you are safe and older, and the past version, where something happened that didn't feel fully understandable. That gap between then and now can make the memory feel distant in one way, but still emotionally close in another. What is important to be very clear about, though, is that none of this responsibility was ever yours. At that age, there is no expectation for a child to fully understand risk, manipulation, or intention. A child's role is not to interpret complex emotional or social danger. A child's role is simply to exist and be protected. When that protection is missing or unclear in a moment, the responsibility still does not shift onto the child. The way you responded at the time was shaped entirely by the situation you were placed in. You adapted to it in the only way available to you in that moment. That is not something to judge or question harshly in hindsight. It is simply how human response works under pressure, especially in younger years when emotional tools are still developing. What stands out most strongly in everything you shared is that you made it through it. You got yourself out of the situation when it became too overwhelming, and later you found the courage to speak up and tell someone who could actually take action. That part of your experience is just as real and just as important as the difficult part. It shows that even in confusion and fear, there was still a part of you that moved toward safety and eventually toward truth. Over time, experiences like this often settle into memory in a different way. They don't disappear, but they also stop feeling as sharp as they once did. They become something you can look at with more distance, even if they still carry emotional weight. Sometimes they surface in reflection, sometimes in unexpected thoughts, and sometimes just as a quiet awareness of how fragile certain moments in life can be. It also makes complete sense if part of you still thinks about how differently things could have gone. That kind of reflection is very natural after early experiences involving uncertainty or fear. The mind tries to replay scenarios almost as a way of understanding control after the fact. But it is important to gently remember that you were never in a position where control was truly yours in that situation. You were responding within the limits of your age and environment. In the end, what remains most important is not just what happened, but what it says about your ability to move forward from it. The fact that you can now talk about it, reflect on it, and understand it with more clarity shows a level of processing that takes time and distance. These kinds of experiences don't define who someone is, but they do become part of the emotional background they carry through life. And if anything, it is completely understandable that what stays with you most is not just the event itself, but the feeling of how uncertain and unreal it all seemed. That feeling is often the last thing to fade, even long after everything else is settled. What your friend went through is something that can stay in a person's mind for a long time, not only because of how uncomfortable it sounds, but because of how normal everything looked right up until the moment it didn't. When you hear stories like this, what really stands out is not a single dramatic scene, but the way everything begins in such an ordinary way that no one would feel any reason to be alert. There is no obvious warning, no clear sign that something is wrong, and no moment that immediately feels dangerous. Instead, it all starts in a setting that feels completely normal, even relaxed, where nothing unusual seems to be happening at all. It was a typical social environment, the kind where people are talking, spending time together, and just going with the flow of the evening. In places like this, trust builds naturally. If people are not thinking in terms of risk or danger, they are thinking about conversations, timing, getting home, and simple everyday decisions. The mind is not in a protective mode, it is in a social mode. And that difference matters more than most people realize. In that kind of setting, someone offering help does not feel strange. In fact, it can feel kind. It can feel considerate. It can feel like a small act of support in a moment where everything already feels normal and familiar. There is no reason, at least on the surface, to question it deeply. That is exactly why situations like this are so difficult to recognize while they are happening. When a person is tired, relaxed, or slightly impaired in judgment from a long day or a social environment, the brain naturally becomes less sharp about evaluating risk. It is not something people choose. It is just how human attention works. Small details are ignored. Doubts are pushed aside. Things that might normally feel worth thinking twice about suddenly feel acceptable enough in the moment. So when help is offered in a smooth and effortless way, it blends into that mental state very easily. There is no disruption in the flow of the moment, no sudden reason to stop and analyze everything. It just becomes part of the situation like everything else around it. And once something becomes part of the flow, it is much harder to step outside of it and see it clearly. What makes your friend's experience especially unsettling is how ordinary everything must have felt at each step. There was no point where everything suddenly looked dangerous in a clear and obvious way. Instead, it was more subtle than that. It was a gradual movement from one moment to the next, where each step on its own seemed harmless enough that it did not trigger concern. This is often what makes real-life situations like this so hard to process afterward. People expect danger to look like danger. They expect clear warning signs, loud signals, or moments that force immediate attention. But in reality, some of the most uncomfortable situations begin quietly, without any dramatic shift. They build through normal decisions that, one by one, do not seem important enough to question. In your friend's case, what adds another layer of tension is how easily things could have continued in that same direction without interruption. There was nothing built into the situation that automatically forced a stop. No external check, No sudden realization from others, and nothing that would naturally break the flow. It depended entirely on awareness returning at the right moment. And that is where everything changes. At some point during the journey, she woke up. That moment becomes the turning point of the entire experience. Before that, everything was passive. Events were simply unfolding one after another without resistance. But the moment awareness returns, the entire situation changes shape. The mind shifts from being relaxed or unalert to becoming active again. Questions begin to form. Confusion appears. Something that felt normal a moment ago suddenly feels unclear. That shift in awareness is powerful because it interrupts continuity. It breaks the smooth progression of events. It introduces uncertainty where there was none before. And uncertainty is what allows a person to reassess what is happening around them. When she realized something felt off and began to question it, that alone changed the direction of the situation. It created resistance. It slowed everything down mentally, even if things were still physically in motion. That gap between what is happening and what feels acceptable is often where people regain control of situations they were previously just going along with. What follows in these moments is usually confusion first, not clarity. It is not immediate understanding. It is a series of questions. Where am I? How did I get here? What is happening right now? Those questions do not always come in a clean or organized way. They appear in fragments, often mixed with uncertainty and hesitation. But even that confusion is important because it replaces passive acceptance. It forces the brain back into an active state. And once that happens, decisions can start to change. Her decision to question the situation, to become alert, and to express that something did not feel right becomes the key moment that alters everything. Without that shift, the situation could have continued moving forward without interruption. But once doubt is introduced, the direction is no longer stable. From there, things begin to slow down and unravel. What once felt like a single, continuous path now starts to break into separate moments. Attention shifts. Responses change. The situation can no longer move forward in the same smooth way it was before. When authorities become involved, another important layer is added. What was once a personal and isolated experience is now treated as something that needs to be examined more carefully. Questions are asked. Details are reviewed. Patterns are considered. This process is not immediate comfort, but it does bring structure to something that initially felt confusing and uncertain. It also shows that situations like this are not viewed in isolation when they reach that level of attention. They are placed within a broader context where similar reports or concerns may already exist. That changes how the situation is understood. It is no longer just about one moment in time. It becomes part of a larger picture that is being evaluated. What is often difficult for people to process afterward is how close everything came to continuing without interruption, not because of one dramatic failure, but because there was nothing built into the situation that naturally forced it to stop earlier. It depended entirely on timing, awareness, and the return of attention at the right moment. That is why these kinds of experiences tend to leave such a strong emotional impression, even after everything is resolved. The mind does not only focus on what happened, it also keeps returning to what could have happened if awareness had not returned when it did. That second version of the story often feels just as real in memory, even though it never actually unfolded. This is where the emotional weight usually sits. Not in the final outcome, but in the space between outcomes. The uncertainty of how narrow the margin really was. The realization that small delays or differences in timing could have changed everything in ways that are difficult to fully accept. At the same time, it is important to recognize what did happen clearly. She woke up. She noticed something was wrong. She questioned it instead of ignoring it. She created interruption in a situation that was otherwise moving forward without resistance. Those actions matter more than they might seem at first glance. Because in moments where everything feels uncertain, awareness is often the first real form of control a person regains. It does not fix everything instantly, but it changes the direction. It stops automatic continuation and replaces it with evaluation. And that change alone can be enough to shift the outcome. Looking at your friend's experience as a whole. What stays with people is not just the discomfort of the situation, but the realization of how fragile certain moments can be, how easily normal situations can shift without clear warning, and how important it is for awareness to return, even if only suddenly, in the middle of something unclear. In the end, what defines this story is not only how close it came to something worse, but how it was interrupted in time. That interruption is what allowed everything to shift back toward safety. And that is why, even though the experience itself was unsettling, it ends in a way that carries both relief and a deeper awareness of how quickly ordinary moments can change. A friend once shared an experience that stayed in his mind for a long time, not because it was dramatic in a clear or obvious way, but because of how quickly a normal night out can start to feel wrong, even when nothing is fully confirmed in the moment. It happened during what was supposed to be a simple evening out with friends. Nothing about the plan felt unusual. It was just a casual meetup after work, a chance to relax, talk, and spend some time outside the usual routine. The kind of night that many people have without expecting anything out of the ordinary. They went to a bar that was fairly busy, but not overwhelming. Music was playing in the background, people were talking and laughing, and the atmosphere felt normal at first. The group ordered drinks, found a spot to sit, and settled into conversation. Everything felt light and comfortable, the way social evenings usually begin. One of his close friends was with him that night. She was in a good mood when they arrived, talking normally and participating in the conversation. She had a couple of drinks, nothing that seemed excessive or unusual for the setting. At least that's how it appeared at the beginning. As time passed, something started to shift. It wasn't immediate or dramatic. At first, it was small things that could easily be ignored. Her speech started to slow slightly. She seemed a bit more unsteady when standing up. Her reactions became less sharp, like her focus was drifting in and out. In a loud, busy environment, these changes could have been brushed off as normal effects of alcohol, especially if someone is tired or hasn't eaten properly. But the change felt faster than expected. There was a point where her level of intoxication seemed to increase in a short amount of time in a way that didn't fully match what she had consumed. That was the first moment he started paying closer attention. It wasn't panic yet, just a quiet sense that something didn't quite fit. They tried to keep the evening going, but her condition continued to change. She became more unsteady and confused. Her ability to follow conversation dropped noticeably. At times, she seemed unaware of what was happening around her for a few seconds at a time. It wasn't the gradual kind of intoxication people usually recognize. It felt uneven and unpredictable. Around this time, something else happened that made the situation even more uncomfortable. A couple of unfamiliar people nearby started engaging with their group in a way that felt slightly too direct. At first, it seemed harmless, just casual interaction in a public place. But then those individuals began focusing more attention on his friend. They were speaking to her directly, trying to guide her attention away from the group, and suggesting she step away for fresh air or some space. It might have looked normal from the outside, but the timing felt off. She was clearly not in a stable condition, and yet there was pressure, subtle but persistent, to separate her from her friends. That combination is what made the situation feel wrong. It wasn't one single event, but the way different things started happening at the same time that raised concern. He made a decision to stay close to her. At that point, he stopped treating it like a normal night out and started focusing entirely on keeping an eye on her condition. He made sure she wasn't left alone, stayed physically near her, and kept the conversation centered around leaving or getting her home safely if needed. Her condition continued to worsen. She became more disoriented and eventually reached a point where she was struggling to stand properly. It was no longer something that could be explained as just having a few drinks. Something about the speed and intensity of the change felt wrong, even if there was no clear explanation in the moment. He decided it was time to leave. Getting her out of the bar wasn't simple. She needed support to walk, and the environment itself was loud and distracting. But he stayed focused on one thing: getting her into a safer place. There was no interest anymore in staying, explaining, or debating what was happening. The priority had become clear. Outside, the air helped slightly, but she was still in a very weak and unstable state. He made sure she got home safely, staying with her the entire time. Once they were back, she was able to rest, but her condition was still concerning. Later that night and into the next day, things became more worrying. She experienced a severe reaction afterward. There was heavy confusion, strong sickness, and a complete gap in memory regarding parts of the evening. She could not clearly recall how the night progressed after a certain point. That kind of memory loss is something that naturally raises concern, especially when it doesn't align with expected alcohol effects alone. At that stage, there was a lot of uncertainty. No one could say with full confidence what exactly caused the reaction. There are situations where alcohol alone can hit harder than expected, especially if someone hasn't eaten enough, is tired, or unknowingly consumes stronger drinks than intended. There are also situations where drinks may be altered or contaminated, but without testing or evidence at the time, it is never possible to be completely certain afterward. That uncertainty is part of what made the experience so unsettling. There was no clear answer to hold on to, only the memory of how quickly things changed and how abnormal the progression felt in real time. What stayed with him the most, though, was not just what happened afterward, but the feeling during the moment itself, that sense that something was off before there was any proof. The hesitation turning into concern, the concern turning into action, and the realization that small decisions in situations like that can matter more than anything else. Looking back, he often reflected on how easy it would have been to ignore those early signs. It would have been simple to assume she had just drunk a bit too much, or that she needed a few minutes to recover. It would have been easy to accept the reassurance of strangers, or let the situation continue without stepping in. But he didn't do that. Instead, he stayed close, paid attention, and trusted his instinct that something was not right. That decision shaped everything that followed. Another important part of the story is how quickly environments can change perception. In a busy place with music, noise, and movement, it becomes harder to notice gradual changes in someone's condition. What might stand out clearly in a quiet setting can feel less obvious in a crowded one. That's why subtle signs often matter more than people realize. He also learned something about how social pressure can appear in unexpected ways. Not always aggressive, not always obvious, but sometimes just enough to make a situation feel confusing. People suggesting actions, trying to guide decisions, or encouraging separation at the wrong moment can create discomfort, especially when someone is already vulnerable. In hindsight, he felt that trusting that discomfort was the right thing to do. There are also practical lessons that came from the experience. One of the most important was the value of staying physically close in situations where someone is clearly not well, not leaving them alone, not assuming someone else will handle it, and not waiting too long before making a decision to leave. These are small choices, but they can have a big impact when timing matters. Another lesson was the importance of not ignoring instincts. There wasn't any clear evidence at the time, only a feeling that something didn't match what was expected. But that feeling was enough to take action. And in situations where clarity is missing, that instinct can become one of the most reliable signals a person has. After everything settled, his friend eventually recovered. The worst of the symptoms passed, and with time she returned to normal health. Life moved on, as it usually does. But the memory of that night stayed with both of them in a quiet way. It didn't become a dramatic story they told often. Instead, it became something they simply understood between them. A reminder of how quickly things can change, even in a setting that feels completely ordinary at the start. What makes the experience linger in his mind is not fear alone, but awareness. Awareness of how unpredictable situations can be. Awareness of how important it is to notice small changes. An awareness of how a simple decision to stay, observe, and act can make a real difference in someone's safety. In the end, there was no dramatic conclusion, no clear explanation that tied everything together neatly. Just a night that started like any other and ended with a reminder that paying attention can sometimes be the most important thing you do for someone you care about. A friend once shared a university experience that stayed with them for a long time, not because anything officially happened in the end, but because of how quickly a fun, normal night can turn into something that feels deeply wrong without any clear proof in the moment. It started like a typical student night out. They were heading to a club where there were free shots being offered, and like many university plans, it was meant to be simple, light-hearted, and spontaneous. Nothing about the evening carried any sense of danger at the beginning. It was just excitement, music, and the usual anticipation of a night out with friends. On the way there, things shifted unexpectedly. They were approached and intercepted by a small group consisting of 2 women and 1 man. The man stayed slightly behind and didn't really engage in conversation at first. The women, however, were very active and immediately started talking to them, trying to persuade them to change their plans and go somewhere else instead of the club they were originally heading to. At first, my friend and their companion were resistant. They already had a destination in mind, and there was no real reason to change course. But the women were persistent in a way that felt increasingly strong, not just casually suggesting, but actively pushing the idea that they should come along. They kept emphasizing that the man with them had money, that he would cover their entry, and that he would pay for drinks throughout the night. The message was repeated enough that it started to feel less like a friendly suggestion and more like persuasion, with a clear goal behind it. Eventually, they agreed to go along. When they arrived at the entrance of the new club, the man stepped forward and paid for everyone. One detail that stood out immediately was that his wallet was filled with cash, noticeably stuffed in a way that made it hard not to notice. It created an odd impression, something that didn't fully match the rest of the situation, but at the time, it was just a passing thought. Once inside, things changed very quickly. There was barely any time for my friend and their companion to stay together or even check in with each other. Almost immediately, the group split them apart. One of the women took the friend away toward the dance floor, while the man directed my friend toward the bar area. It didn't feel like a natural separation. It felt arranged. The man physically guided them by the hand toward the bar. That was the first moment where unease really started to build. Up until that point, he had barely spoken. His silence stood out more than anything else. The only direct interaction was practical, asking what drinks they wanted. My friend ordered something simple, but noticed that the man ordered stronger drinks in larger quantities, which added another layer of discomfort. He didn't get drinks for himself or the others, which felt strange in a social setting like that. The feeling of uneasiness grew slowly but steadily. Then my friend tried to shift the situation by saying they wanted to find their companion. That simple statement seemed to change the man's behavior immediately. He became suddenly more talkative, more physically forward, and noticeably more insistent that they stay with him instead. He began talking about money, lifestyle, and how he would treat them well, trying to redirect attention away from the concern they had just expressed. At that point, the discomfort turned into urgency. My friend was holding drinks they didn't really want, more focused on what was happening around them than anything else. The main concern was no longer the night itself, but the fact that their companion was somewhere unknown, out of sight, and that the situation felt increasingly controlled by people they didn't know. Eventually, they managed to create an opportunity to separate themselves from the man. The exact details of how it happened are a bit unclear in their memory, which is understandable in a high-stress moment like that. Sometimes in situations like this, people don't remember every step clearly, only the need to get out and find safety. What they do remember is ending up on the dance floor area and quickly getting rid of the drinks, just in case, and then moving urgently through the crowd trying to locate their friend. When they couldn't find her inside, they went outside to the smoking area, thinking that maybe she might end up there or that it would be easier to regroup. Even though she didn't smoke, it felt like a logical place to check. They also asked other people they knew if they had seen her and explained that something felt off. Even at that stage, the situation still wasn't fully clear. It was more a growing sense that something about the separation and the behavior of the group they had met didn't feel right. While they were talking, the atmosphere suddenly changed again when someone forcefully opened the door to the smoking area, slamming it hard enough that it hit the wall. That sudden interruption broke the conversation and immediately drew attention. And then, right after that, their friend appeared. She came out in an emotional state, visibly upset and angry, shouting that she had been left alone. She explained that the two women had taken her away and were trying to convince her to go to a house outside the city, in an area she described as being near the red light district. She said she felt pressured and uncomfortable, and that she had managed to leave only by finding a way to separate herself from them. In that moment, both of them realized they had been experiencing the same situation from different sides, without being able to communicate it to each other. They hadn't discussed their concerns at the time, but they had both independently reached the same unsettling interpretation of what was happening. Afterward, they often talked about it as a strange, almost unreal experience. Not because anything fully confirmed their fears, but because of how strongly their instincts aligned in the moment, and how quickly the situation escalated from a normal night out into something that felt unsafe and controlled. What stayed with them most was the realization of how easy it was to be separated. how quickly trust can be manipulated in social environments, and how confusion can build when people are moved apart and given different narratives at the same time. Even though they managed to leave safely and nothing officially happened, the experience left a lasting impression. It became one of those nights they never fully forget, not because of what was proven, but because of how clearly it showed them how important it is to stay aware, stay together, and trust discomfort when something feels off. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. I grew up in a neighborhood that most people would probably describe as rough around the edges. It wasn't the kind of place where everything felt dangerous all the time, but it also wasn't the kind of place where you could completely relax either. As a kid, you don't really analyze that feeling in words. You just learn certain rules without anyone teaching them. You learn which streets to avoid, which sounds to ignore, and which places feel fun, even if adults don't really approve. For me, one of those places was a patch of woods and an abandoned house right next to where I lived. It wasn't unusual for kids in the area to explore places like that. There wasn't much else to do, and when you're around 8 or 9 years old, anything slightly mysterious or empty becomes an adventure. That house had become part of my routine. It felt like a playground in a strange way, even though I knew it wasn't really meant to be one. I would spend hours outside making up games, imagining stories, and turning whatever I could find into something fun. That day, I remember being completely absorbed in my own little world. I was playing near the yard of that abandoned house, moving around bushes and low branches, pretending I was part of some wrestling match I had seen on TV. In my mind, it wasn't just sticks and shrubs. It was something much bigger and more exciting. I didn't think about danger or safety. I didn't think about who might be nearby or what time it was getting to be. I was just a kid doing what kids do when they have space to play. But sometimes, places that feel empty are not as empty as they seem. Inside that abandoned house, there were people I didn't know. I had no idea they were there. I didn't hear them and I didn't see them. I was making noise without realizing it, moving branches and rustling the bushes as I played. To me, it was nothing, just part of the game. But inside the house, those sounds were heard very differently. Later, I learned that the people inside thought they were dealing with a possible threat. They didn't know it was a child outside. They couldn't see clearly through the walls and windows, and the noise outside made them react in fear or suspicion. In that moment, everything inside that house shifted into something tense and defensive. What happened next escalated in a way that I still think about sometimes, even after all these years. I remember hearing a sudden, loud noise, the kind that doesn't belong in a normal day. Glass breaking, sharp and immediate, came from the direction of the house. At first, my brain didn't even understand what it was. It didn't connect to anything familiar. It just felt like a sudden, violent interruption in the middle of a normal afternoon. Then there was another sound, and that's when things started to register as danger. I realized something was happening that wasn't part of any game or imagination. I wasn't safe where I was standing. I didn't see anyone clearly at first, just movement and chaos from inside the house. And then I saw enough to understand that I needed to leave immediately. My body reacted before my mind fully caught up. I started running. I don't remember thinking about direction or planning. I just ran toward the only place that made sense at that age, which was my home right next door. It wasn't far, but in moments like that, see, even a short distance can feel long and unclear. I remember branches and fences passing by in a blur. My focus narrowed completely to getting inside as fast as possible. Behind me, I remember more noise, more glass breaking, more sharp sounds that I now understand were meant to scare or respond to what they thought was happening. But at the time, all I knew was that I was trying to get away from it. When I reached my house, I ran straight inside through the side door. I didn't stop to think about locking it or closing it properly. I just got in. Everything inside felt suddenly too quiet compared to what was happening outside. That contrast is something I still remember clearly. One moment there is chaos and fear, and the next you are standing in your own home, trying to understand what just happened. My mom was there, and she immediately sensed something was wrong just by looking at me. I must have looked panicked because before I even fully explained anything, she reacted with alarm. I remember her saying that she thought someone was shooting outside. The way she said it made everything feel even more real. It was no longer just confusion in my head. It was something dangerous happening in our space, in our neighborhood, right outside our door. I told her what I thought I had seen, still trying to process it myself. I said I thought they were shooting at me. Even saying it out loud felt strange, like I was describing something that didn't fully belong in my life. At that age, you don't really have the emotional framework to understand something like that. It feels too big for your world. But my mom didn't hesitate. Her reaction changed instantly. It was protective, immediate, and intense. She opened the front door and shouted outside, demanding to know who was shooting at her child. It wasn't a calm or measured response. It was pure instinct. The kind of reaction a parent has when fear takes over reason for a moment. From outside, there was a response, but not one that helped the situation. I remember more noise, more tension, and then a sense of movement away from the house. The people outside didn't stay. They left quickly after that moment. Everything that happened outside ended as suddenly as it began. Afterwards, everything felt strange and quiet again, like the world was trying to return to normal, but nobody inside the house fully could. There was a sense of disbelief, like trying to understand something that didn't fit into everyday life. My mom checked on me repeatedly, trying to make sure I was okay, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. As a child, I didn't fully process the weight of it at the time. Kids tend to move on faster than adults expect, especially when they don't fully understand the long-term meaning of an event. I went back to playing outside again in the following days, though maybe not in quite the same way. There was a subtle awareness after that, something I couldn't really explain but could feel. The abandoned house was still there. The neighborhood was still the same in many ways. Life continued. But something had shifted in the background of how I saw things, even if I didn't have the words for it yet. What stayed with me more than anything wasn't just the event itself, but how quickly everything changed. One moment I was a kid playing in bushes, completely absorbed in imagination. The next moment there was fear, confusion, and danger unfolding in a place I thought of as familiar. It also made me realize something later in life that I didn't understand at the time. People react to situations based on what they think is happening, not always what is actually happening. Misunderstandings can escalate in ways that no one intends, and when fear is involved, things can move very fast without anyone having time to stop and think clearly. Looking back now, I can see how fragile that entire moment was, how many things had to align in the worst possible way for it to happen at all. A child playing, a building with unknown people inside, a noise that could be misinterpreted, fear on both sides, and then a rapid chain of reactions that could have ended very differently. Even though years have passed, the memory still sits somewhere in the back of my mind. Not as something I relive often, but as something I understand differently now than I did back then. At the time, it was just confusion and fear. Now it feels more like a lesson about how unpredictable life can be, especially when people are acting on incomplete information. Most of all, it reminds me how quickly childhood innocence can collide with realities that you are not ready for, and how some moments stay with you not because they define your life, but because they briefly showed you how fast it can change without warning. A few years ago, I was living in a large city where I didn't really know many people. It was one of those phases in life where everything feels temporary and unanchored. You're constantly surrounded by strangers, always moving through crowds, yet still carrying that quiet sense of being alone. I had been seeing a guy who had come to visit me from abroad, and when his trip ended, I went with him to the train station to see him off. After he left, I made my way back into the metro to go home. It was early afternoon, around 2 p.m., and the city was bright and active in that ordinary way it often is. Nothing about the day felt unusual. It was calm, routine, and predictable, the kind of moment you don't remember because nothing stands out. When I reached the platform, I sat down on a bench next to a man. We made brief eye contact and exchanged a simple hello. It was nothing meaningful, just a small, automatic social gesture that usually disappears from memory within seconds. Even so, I remember a faint feeling in the back of my mind that something about him didn't sit entirely right with me. Nothing concrete, nothing I could explain, just a quiet instinct that I tried to dismiss because there was no reason to give it weight. When the train arrived, we both boarded. The carriage was crowded, and like everyone else, I just took whatever space I could find. I ended up sitting down, and he took a seat directly across from me. At first, I reassured myself that this meant nothing. In a packed metro, people end up sitting opposite each other all the time. It's just how space works in a busy city. For a short while, the uneasiness faded. He even started talking to another man nearby, which made me feel more comfortable for a moment. It gave the impression that he wasn't focused on me, that maybe I had misread the earlier feeling completely. I remember convincing myself that I was overthinking it and that there was nothing unusual going on. A few stops later, the other man got off the train. The first man stayed. I didn't think much of it immediately. But as my stop began to approach and I prepared to change lines, I stood up. Almost instantly, he stood up as well. That was the first moment where something in me sharpened again. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt noticed. As I started walking through the carriage, I caught sight of his reflection in the window. He was looking at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, not just casually glancing, but slowly scanning and then returning his gaze upward again. It felt deliberate in a way that made my stomach tighten. That was the point where discomfort turned into real concern. When the doors opened, I stepped off quickly and started walking fast along the platform, trying to put distance between us and figure out where I needed to go next. I focused on blending into the flow of people, trying to act normal while internally becoming more alert. But as I moved, I became aware that he had gotten off the train too. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was going the same direction. Maybe it was coincidence. But then I changed direction slightly and noticed he adjusted as well. I changed again, and again he followed. After a few moments of this, it stopped feeling like chance. It felt like pattern, like attention directed specifically at me. And that changes the entire experience. It's no longer just discomfort. It becomes awareness that you are being tracked. At that point, I made the decision to leave the situation as quickly as possible. I headed toward the exit that would allow me to change lines and continue home, but the passageway was crowded with people moving in different directions, slowing everything down. That small delay suddenly felt very significant, because he caught up. He came closer and closer until there was very little space between us. I found myself near a wall, essentially cornered in movement rather than physically trapped, but still unable to easily step away without pushing through people. He came up beside me, smiling, acting as if nothing unusual was happening, and asked casually, "Hello, how are you?" But the timing, the distance, and the situation made it feel anything but normal. It didn't feel like a random conversation. It felt like control over space, like the situation had been narrowed down until I had very few options left. What struck me most in that moment was how normal everything around us looked. People were still walking past. No one was reacting. No one was stopping. It created a strange feeling of isolation, like something serious was happening in a place that refused to acknowledge it. That was the moment I stopped waiting for anything external to change the situation. I looked around quickly and noticed a staircase leading down to another level. Without giving myself time to overthink it, I ran. It wasn't a gradual decision. It was immediate, almost instinctive. I broke away from the space and sprinted toward the stairs. The sudden movement seemed to catch him off guard for just long enough to create a gap. He hesitated briefly, and that hesitation mattered more than anything else in that moment. I ran down the stairs and reached a metro platform just as a train was arriving. I got inside at the last second, and as the doors began to close, I turned back and I saw him coming down after me, also running. But he didn't make it in time. The doors shut between us, and the train moved away. For the first time since the situation began, there was distance again. Real distance. I remember sitting there on the train, still shaking from adrenaline, trying to process what had just happened. Strangely enough, I had ended up on the correct line to get home without even planning it properly. But at that point, that detail didn't matter at all. My mind was still catching up to my body. In the hours and days afterward, the experience didn't fade the way normal memories do. It stayed sharp. Not because anything physically happened in the end, but because of how the situation unfolded step by step, how quickly normality shifted into something that felt unsafe, and how aware I became of exits, reflections, and movement in crowded spaces. It also changed how I understand silence in public places. How easily something can be happening right beside you and still go unnoticed by everyone else. That feeling of being surrounded by people, but still effectively alone in a critical moment, is something that's hard to forget once you've felt it. What remains most vivid in my memory isn't just the man or the chase through the station, but the speed of the shift itself. One moment I was just another person heading home after a normal afternoon, and the next I was fully focused on survival decisions, reading space, watching reflections, and choosing exits in seconds. And once your mind learns how fast that shift can happen, it never fully goes back to the way it was before. A friend once shared a story that stayed with him for a long time, not because it was dramatic in a loud or sensational way, but because of how heavy it felt, and how clearly it showed how quickly life can collapse when a situation spirals beyond control. He had heard it from his friend's mother, a woman who had spent part of her earlier life around gang circles in Christchurch, New Zealand. Over the years, she had occasionally spoken about that period of her life, usually in fragments rather than full stories. Most of what she shared were scattered memories, moments she had witnessed or heard about, the kind of things people carry with them but don't often fully revisit. But there was one particular incident she described that always seemed to sit differently from the rest. It carried more weight, and as if even speaking about it brought back a level of discomfort that never really faded. It involved a man she knew personally, someone who ended up living in a very unstable situation with his wife. At that point in their lives, both of them were heavily affected by substance use, and their home environment had become unpredictable and emotionally volatile. It was not a stable or safe setting, and over time, that instability had only grown worse. According to her account, the incident began at home during what seemed like an ordinary moment, but it quickly turned into an argument. There was nothing unusual about the trigger itself, but the reaction to it was intense. With both individuals under the influence, emotions escalated far faster than they normally would have. Words turned sharp, patience disappeared, and the situation began to shift into something far more chaotic than either of them could properly manage. What started as verbal conflict did not stay that way for long. It moved into physical struggle, not in a controlled or clear sequence, but in a confused and unstable way where neither person was fully thinking through their actions. Judgment was impaired. Reactions were impulsive, and everything was happening too fast for anyone involved to slow it down or step back. In the middle of this chaos, things took a tragic turn. At one point during the struggle, she fell backward and went through a glass sliding door. The impact was severe, and the broken glass added another layer of danger to an already critical situation. It was not a single clean injury, but a combination of trauma from the fall and multiple cuts and wounds caused by shattered glass. In the immediate aftermath, the situation became even more disoriented. The man, still heavily affected by substances and shock, did not fully understand the severity of what had just happened. His perception of reality was fragmented, as if he was trying to process something that his mind could not fully organize in that moment. Instead of immediately recognizing how serious her condition was, he attempted to move her. In his impaired state, he did not realize the extent of the injuries or how dangerous movement could be. Everything felt confused and unreal, as though the situation was unfolding in pieces rather than as a clear, understandable event. Eventually, he brought her back inside the house, and still without fully grasping how critical things had become. One of the most haunting parts of the story was that children were present in the home during all of this. They were there in the same environment, witnessing confusion and distress without having any real ability to understand or respond. They were far too young to comprehend what was happening, yet old enough to absorb the emotional atmosphere of fear and chaos around them. That detail added a deep and lasting emotional weight to the story, even long after it was told. Despite efforts in the aftermath, she did not survive her injuries. She passed away shortly after the incident. The speed at which everything escalated from an argument to a fatal outcome left a lasting impact on those connected to the situation. There was no long build-up, in no extended timeline that people could process gradually. It all unfolded within a short and irreversible sequence of events. Afterward, the man was taken into custody. Once the immediate shock settled and the effects of substances wore off, the reality of what had happened began to set in more clearly. According to the account, he struggled deeply with understanding and accepting it. It was as if his mind could not fully reconcile the outcome with his own actions during that altered state. A few days later, while still in custody, he died by suicide. What made the story so difficult to forget was not only the individual events, but the chain reaction they created. One unstable moment led to another, and then another, until multiple lives were permanently altered. The consequences did not stop with the immediate individuals involved. They extended outward, affecting children and others connected to the situation in ways that would last far beyond that single night. For the person hearing the story, what lingered was not any specific detail, but the emotional weight of how quickly everything shifted. It highlighted how fragile control can become when substances, emotional instability, and conflict come together in the same space. In such environments, situations can escalate without warning, and once momentum builds, it becomes extremely difficult to stop or reverse. It also brought attention to the presence of the children in a way that was hard to ignore, not because of what they explicitly understood, but because of what it means to grow up around moments of extreme instability. Even when children do not fully comprehend events at the time, those experiences can leave impressions that remain in the background of memory, shaping how safety and stability are understood later in life. More than anything, the story reflected how quickly things can unravel when people lose control of themselves and their surroundings. In environments where substance use and emotional volatility overlap, the margin for error becomes extremely small. Small disagreements can escalate rapidly, and once a situation reaches a certain point, it can move beyond anyone's ability to intervene effectively. It also pointed to a difficult truth, that many tragedies like this do not begin with a clear intention to cause harm. Instead, they unfold through impaired judgment, emotional escalation, and moments where consequences are not fully understood until it is already too late to change them. That understanding does not reduce the outcome, but it does explain how situations can spiral so quickly beyond control. For the friend who heard it, the story never fully left his mind. It did not stay present in an active or daily way, but it would resurface from time to time, carrying the same quiet heaviness each time it returned. Not as a vivid scene, but as a feeling of reflection and unease. Over time, it changed the way he thought about certain environments, especially those where substance use and emotional tension exist together. It made him more aware of how quickly stability can break down, and how important it is to recognize when a situation is no longer safe before it reaches a point of no return. But beyond awareness or caution, what stayed with him most was the emotional residue of it all. The sense that multiple lives had been permanently altered in a very short span of time, without anyone truly understanding where things were heading until it was already too late. There was no neat resolution to hold on to, no simple lesson that could fully contain what had happened. It was just a sequence of events that unfolded, left lasting consequences, and remained in memory as something that could not be undone. And in that way, it stayed with him, not as a single moment, but as a quiet reminder of how fragile human situations become when everything starts to slip beyond control. A colleague once shared something with me that he still thinks about, even after many years. It wasn't a story with a dramatic external event or something that others could easily point to and say, "This happened." Instead, it was something much harder to explain, because it was about how reality itself can feel slightly out of place while everything around you continues as normal. He was working in a busy emergency medical environment at the time. The kind of place where every minute is filled with urgency, movement, and decisions that need to be made quickly. Patients come in constantly, staff rotate between cases, alarms go off in the background, and there is rarely any real pause in the entire shift. It was the type of setting where people become used to pressure, because pressure is part of the job. On that particular day, he had already been working for several hours. Nothing about the shift had started in any unusual way. It was busy, but not different from other days. He was fully focused on his responsibilities, moving from one case to another, doing what needed to be done without hesitation. Everything felt normal in the way that long shifts often do, where you stop thinking about time and just continue working. At some point during the shift, a major emergency situation came in. A large number of patients arrived in a short time, and the environment quickly became more intense. The team was suddenly handling multiple critical cases at once. There was no time to think about anything outside the immediate tasks. It became one of those situations where every person is fully absorbed in their role, doing their part to manage the flow of patients and stabilize those in need. He remembered moving quickly between tasks, focusing on clinical work, making decisions, checking information, and communicating with others on the team. Everything he did made sense. Everything followed the normal structure of emergency response. He was not confused about what he was doing. In fact, he described himself as unusually clear and focused during that time, almost like the pressure sharpened his attention rather than weakening it. But at some point during this period, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't something he noticed immediately. There was no single moment where everything changed suddenly. Instead, it started with small impressions that didn't fully fit together. He would look at familiar areas of the department and feel, for a brief moment, like they were not exactly as he remembered them. The layout seemed slightly unfamiliar, even though he knew logically that nothing had changed. Equipment he used every day looked as if it was placed differently, even when it wasn't. At first, he dismissed it. In a busy environment, especially during high-pressure situations, it is normal for the mind to feel overloaded. He assumed it was just fatigue or distraction. He continued working, focusing on patients and tasks, not giving much attention to those strange impressions. But the feeling did not completely go away. As time passed, those moments became more noticeable. It was not that anything in the environment was actually changing. Rather, it felt like his perception of it was not fully matching what he expected to see. People around him were behaving normally. Colleagues were communicating clearly. Everything was functioning as it should. And yet, there was this quiet sense that something about familiarity was slightly distorted. He later described it as if the environment was both recognizable and unfamiliar at the same time. Not in a way that made him unable to function, but in a way that made him pause internally for a fraction of a second before continuing his work. What made the experience more unsettling was that no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. When he casually checked with others, everything they described matched reality as it was supposed to be. There were no changes, no confusion, nothing out of place. This created a strange contrast between his internal experience and external confirmation. Despite this, he continued performing his duties. He was still able to assess patients, respond to emergencies, calculate treatments, and communicate effectively with the team. On the surface, Nothing about his performance changed. He was functioning fully in a professional capacity, doing exactly what was required in a high-responsibility environment. But internally, there was a growing sense of discomfort that he could not easily ignore. The feeling became more noticeable during quieter moments between tasks. When there was a brief pause in immediate action, his awareness of the environment became sharper again, and with it came the same sense of slight unfamiliarity. Familiar rooms did not feel fully anchored. Familiar pathways in the department felt subtly different, even though he knew they were not. He also noticed that his memory of certain moments during the shift felt slightly disconnected. Not missing, but as if the sequence of events was not flowing in a completely smooth line. He could still recall everything he needed for work, but the emotional sense of continuity felt slightly interrupted. At one point, he paused for a moment and tried to ground himself by focusing on simple details: the sound of equipment, the movement of people, the structure of the room. These things were all present and normal. There was nothing objectively wrong. And yet the internal experience still carried that strange mismatch between perception and expectation. What made the situation especially difficult was that he could not point to a single cause. There was no obvious event that explained it. No injury, no sudden shock, no external disruption. Everything around him was stable, which made the internal experience even harder to understand. As the shift continued, the intensity of the emergency gradually reduced. The most critical phase passed, and the environment slowly began to settle back into a more controlled rhythm. Patients were stabilized, tasks were completed, and the immediate pressure eased. It was only then, when things slowed down slightly, that he began to fully notice how exhausted he actually was. Not just physically, but mentally. The kind of exhaustion that builds quietly over time without being fully recognized while you are still in motion. Once the shift ended, the experience did not immediately leave his mind. In fact, it became more noticeable afterward. When he stepped away from the environment and returned to normal surroundings, he still carried the memory of that strange sense of familiarity. It lingered in his thoughts, even though everything around him was now completely normal. That night, when he tried to rest, he found it difficult to fully disconnect from the experience. His mind kept returning to those moments where reality felt slightly misaligned. He questioned it repeatedly, trying to make sense of it logically. Everything he remembered made sense in terms of events, but the internal feeling attached to those events did not fit neatly into explanation. Over the following days, he noticed that the intensity of the experience gradually faded. The strange perception did not continue. His environment returned to feeling completely normal, familiar, and stable. He was able to continue working without any similar experiences occurring again. But even though it did not repeat, it did not disappear from his memory. What stayed with him was not confusion about his ability to do his job, because that remained intact throughout. What stayed with him was the realization that under extreme pressure, the mind can sometimes create experiences that feel very real in the moment, even when nothing external has changed. It made him more aware of how complex perception can be, especially in environments where stress and responsibility are constant. He also reflected on how difficult it is to explain such experiences to others, because when described in words, they can sound vague or abstract. But in the moment, they feel very real, very immediate, and very difficult to ignore. That contrast between lived experience and external explanation is part of what made it stay in his memory for so long. Over time, he came to accept it not as something frightening, but as something unusual that his mind went through under conditions of heavy load. not something that defined him, and not something that indicated any lasting problem, but simply a rare experience during an intense period of work. Looking back, he often describes it as a reminder of how closely perception and stress are connected. How even in highly trained, experienced professionals, the brain can behave in unexpected ways when pushed for long periods without rest. And how important it is to recognize that human cognition is not a fixed, unchanging system, but something that can shift under pressure in subtle ways. He also became more understanding toward others who describe experiences that are difficult to explain clearly, because he now knew from personal experience that not everything meaningful or real in terms of feeling always translates easily into external confirmation. In the end, what remains from that period is not fear, but awareness. Awareness that even when everything appears stable on the outside, the internal experience of reality can sometimes take on a different texture during extreme conditions. An awareness that these moments, even if temporary and resolved, can leave a lasting impression simply because of how unusual they feel. It is not a story with a dramatic ending. There is no single conclusion or defining moment of resolution. It is simply the memory of a shift in perception during a demanding time, something that passed, but was never completely forgotten. And for him, that was enough for it to stay with him all these years later, quietly sitting in the background of his memory, reminding him of how complex the human mind can be when pushed to its limits.